latitude, prevailing winds and ocean currents, mountains and the nearness to the sea. Things like that determine what we call the climate, determine what the climate of a place will be.
Welcome to Cambridge Zero Climate Talks with Antoinette Nestor
and Amy Munro.
This week, I will be presenting the show on my own, as Amy has been extremely busy with the internships. So this week, I spoke to Markus Gehring from the Faculty of Law at the University of Cambridge. He's an expert in the Centre for European Legal Studies, fellow and director of studies in law at Hughes Hall, and a fellow of the Lauterbach Centre for International Law. I also spoke to Ashwini Laxminarayana, senior software engineer and mom to a wonderful one-year-old girl, and she will be telling us her views as a parent when it comes to issues of climate change, the environment, and sustainability. And Amy spoke to Bonni, Charlie, Barty-King, and Steve Hoath. The three of them have been involved in Wolfson's College Green Impact this year. If you just joined us, you're listening to Cambridge Zero Climate Talks.
So today I am talking to Charlie, Bonni and Steve from Wolfson. Charlie and Bonni have been highly involved in the Wolfson College Student Association and putting together environmental actions and initiatives that association has been taking part in. And Steve has been involved in this year's Green Impact Award submission in the college's Sustainability Committee. Thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you.
Brilliant. So where are all of you at the moment? Are you all still based in Cambridge?
Hi, yeah, so I'm Charlie. I'm based in Trumpington at the moment in a private rent.
Yes, I'm still in college as well. I'm just writing up my thesis for my master's in environmental policy.
And I'm Steve, and I'm presently at home in Papworth Everard, which is a village about 12 miles west of Cambridge.
Brilliant. So all in Cambridge, which has been unusual in the course of these interviews, interestingly. So I wanted to ask how you all first got interested in environmental issues.
Yeah, so I've always found myself working on unrelated areas, but relating it back to sustainability through various means. So at the moment, for my PhD, I work on a sustainable and biodegradable material, doing material science. So I'm not strictly doing sustainability, but I've always related it back to that just randomly. And as with many other people, I've got a bit of existential societal angst at the moment and have done for a few years. So I just decided to start doing something about it, really.
Yeah, so obviously, as I said, I'm doing a master's in environmental policy, so obviously it is very relevant, but I'm part of the land economy department, so I've become a bit of a social scientist. But before that, I did environmental science and biology during my undergrad. And I was elected as an environmental officer to the Students' Union. And so, you know, I have experience of that, I have interest in that and making change and reaching out to people.
I'm Steve again. I was involved on an individual level with installing solar panels at home as part of a project with, I think it was Coton, had a big meeting about this some years ago, and I've had solar panels for nearly 5 years now. And last year I eliminated the oil boiler with an air source heat pump. Nice. So we've been experiencing what it's like to live in a house with both solar and air source heat pumping. It is different, and as a result of that, I upped my ante at college because I'm an emeritus fellow, and I was appointed to the new Sustainability Committee as chairman. So I was very keen to get involved with the students who I'd worked with in previous years as Director of Studies for Engineering undergraduates. So I was very keen to keep that theme going of working with students on environmental issues.
Fantastic. So I know that you've all been involved in a number of initiatives through the Wolfson College Students Association, or Wixer. So could you tell me a little bit more about some of these? I know there's lots and lots and lots, so over to you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've been part of Wixer. I've been on the Wixer committee for a few years now, and this year I decided to run for Green Officer on the encouragement of Engage for Change, which is where I met you, Amy. And that was really, really eye-opening, really interesting. And part of my motivation with doing Green Officer was through that programme. So I joined on to Wixer via that. I got elected in, and I immediately found myself kind of bombarded with queries and questions and emails from sort of all areas of the college, from fellows and staff and students. So I kind of I thought, well, rather than me emailing everyone individually and doing this all on my own, I thought I might as well, seems to be interested, I might as well form a Green Society. And that went ahead, and I got had the support of the college to make that a college level society, which was really good. And it kind of all went from there. We managed to get our society going, had a hugely successful year before COVID kind of disrupted everything. We got a number of Green Talks up and running with our inaugural Green Talk was with the amazing Miss Marianne Konitsk, who's Wolfson alumnus, who is the former EU ambassador at large to the Arctic, and her talk was really, really interesting. And I would advise anyone to go watch it online. And that was really, really interesting, and it's really helped kickstart the interest in our society. And so we did the Green Talks, a number of other initiatives, but really it wasn't, it wasn't one person. I had a green team of very dedicated students who helped me with all this, including Bonni, who's been absolute gem in everything I've been doing. I was wondering, Bonni, do you have any what are your thoughts on the Green Society? It's kind of hard for me to gauge because I've been so sort of swamped by emails and admin.
Yeah, so I've been assisting with those efforts as well. I also sit on Wixer as well. And so my thing that I focus on is waste and recycling in college. It's a perennial issue, but we've been working together to revamp that to make it easier for people and make sure that they're doing the right thing. So there have been a lot of discussions with domestic bursars, for example. So we want to make that easier for everyone and make sure that they're doing the right thing. We have a lot of international students here, which is great. They come from all over the world, but we have to also communicate the message very clearly to them, and to incorporate food waste recycling in everything that we do. So in the past, there has been a sort of student-led sort of composting scheme, which hasn't quite been that successful. So we want to switch to a fully incorporated sort of food waste recycling scheme, which can include all kinds of food, which the college will take responsibility of, to make sure that we're not sending any food waste to landfill. Because it's a situation where when it comes to recycling, people know they should recycle their glass and their paper, and for example, but when it comes to food, the future is that is a recyclable product, and it shouldn't be going into general waste anymore. So aside from waste, the Green Society have also done some things inspired by King's College with the Wildflower Meadow. So we're working with the gardeners and possibly setting aside some spaces that used to be lawns to have some wildflowers going on as well. And most recently, some members of the society are also going to, they've purchased a sewing machine using the college, the Wixer money, and they're going to make some masks out of used textiles, leftover materials from the May ball, which of course didn't happen. So yes, it's been exciting, and it's been great to be part of, and it's come leaps and bounds this year after, previous years there hasn't been much movement in green stuff in this college before.
Fantastic. So I know you've also all been involved in Wolfson's Green Impact submission this year, and I know Wolfson didn't put in a submission last year. So that sounds like a lot of movements happened in college in the past year. So Steve, could you tell us a bit more about Green Impact and how that's changed over the last couple of years?
Certainly. A couple of years ago, we had a very active domestic bursar who had led Wolfson to a couple of gold awards in the previous Green Impact challenges. And then there was a hiatus when the college team felt they didn't have enough buy-in from the students for that year, and there was no submission. And then that domestic bursar also left to join another college as domestic bursar. So as part of the new sustainability committee, we took over the role formally of ensuring there was a leader of the team, for which I volunteered for 1 year, in order to try and harness student support, which duly arrived in spades with so many students, we almost didn't know what to do with them. But that made a big impact on the rest of the college and the staff, and basically meant when we put in our workbook of sustainability and environmental actions for this year, we were very nearly judged at the platinum level. So from a zero start, 2019-20, we got to gold and very nearly platinum. As it happened, we also got in the person of Charlie a special award for student leadership as part of the Green Impact Challenge event. He got that earlier this morning. So you're totally up to date with our activities.
Hot off the press. That's all wonderful. So you've done an awful lot of work over the past year or so, it sounds like. So what's happening now? What's the next big plan?
Well, the college has announced its strategic plan as of about a year ago, and they're setting up a number of hubs, 3 hubs, in Gender Hub, Global Health Hub, and the Sustainability and Conservation Hub. And I've been helping the college organise the Sustainability Hub with input from staff, fellows, and students. The general idea with we've kind of been snowballing is the fact that oftentimes the approach to sustainability is scattergun at best and unimpactful at worst. So the general idea was to try and bring together both professionals and amateurs to try and actually get a holistic approach, because sustainability is a global issue, and conservation, so the natural world, so to speak, is a global issue, and it requires not just engineers and scientists, but it requires people in the creative industry, arts and humanities, to all really be contributing to this. So we all have a responsibility to, and professionally and in your personal lives. So yeah, so that the idea is that we want to try and create a hub where people can do that. So we had our first event last week, even on Friday. Time flies with COVID at the moment. Yeah, and we did our first event, and we've been very intentionally haven't made it a sort of organisation-led thing. We want it to be a self-motivating system, so to speak, where we engage other people to provide the ideas that they think will be most effective. So, for example, 3 of the questions that we asked people to answer during this session in small groups was for them to share what they thought the problem actually is, and to have no bars held back on that. It could be as blue sky thinking or as really directed as you want. Where they thought that we could act as a hub, and what they thought we could do about it. So what the ultimate goals would be, how we would begin. And from that, we've produced a whole set of information that we are now sort of going through and figuring out where our next direction is. But the main idea is to really start pulling together Wolfson's got a very international community. We want to really try and leverage that, and not just within the fellowship or within the staff or within the students. We really want it to be something which is done throughout the whole college structure, and then hopefully use that as an example through our partnerships or through our fellows with industry and things like that, to really demonstrate what they might be able to do, and not just affecting industry, affecting councils, affecting providing information for local people, all sorts. We're sort of figuring it out at the moment, but that's our direction at the moment for the sustainability aspect.
That sounds enormously exciting, and I can see lots and lots of cross links and things that I want to talk to you about after the radio interview as well. So the final question I wanted to ask is, it sounds like you're all really busy doing this. So in our last sort of minute and a half, if you could give me a brief summary of what you do when you're not doing this. What are your academic/professional interests?
I'm a retired fellow now, but I was involved in the engineering department at the Institute for Manufacturing, part of the production processes group, involved on inkjet printing research. So I did a lot of work in collaboration with local companies, and at one point I had a knowledge transfer fellowship to work 50% in a company.
I work at the Institute for Manufacturing in a PhD in Michael de Volder's group of nanomanufacturing, where I work with sustainable material, where we're trying to sort of prove the efficacy of outside of the lab environment.
Excellent. And Bonni?
Yeah, as I said, I'm in the Land Economy Department doing a Master's in Environmental Policy. So coming from an environmental science background, now as a social scientist, has been a bit of a learning curve, but it's been an interesting experience. And I'm in the process of writing 10,000 word thesis on food waste recycling across the UK.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very, very much for coming on.
Thank
Cheers.
you.
Thank you very much.
If you just joined us, you're listening to Cambridge Zero Climate Talks. If you want to contact us, you can do so at info@zero.cam.ac.uk. Markus, thank you very much for joining us today. And for our audience, can you please tell us your full name and what you do, please?
Hello, and thank you. My name is Markus Gehring, and I teach international and EU law here in the Faculty of Law at the University of Cambridge. I'm a fellow of Hughes Hall and direct studies in my college, and I'm a fellow of the Lauterbach Center for International Law and a legal expert in the Center for European Legal Studies. And I've been teaching and researching international and European environmental and sustainable development law. So I'm focusing on the intersection between economic law, social human rights law, and environmental law.
That's a big breadth of different types of laws. And just so we can get to the point sort of straight ahead, so we use our time wisely, Markus, you recently gave evidence to the House of Lords EU Environment Committee. Now, first of all, what is the House of Lords EU Environment Committee?
Yes, so the Environment Committee, the EU Environment Committee is a subcommittee of the EU Committee in the House of Lords. And historically, it was occupied with vetting and reviewing legislation coming from the European Union. Now, the EU Committee in the House of Lords reviews and analyzes the current and future relationship between the UK and the European Union. So the ambit of the EU Environment Committee is, and the task is really to review all proposals about the future relationship in environmental matters. So they had a significant report on fisheries and agriculture. And now they're looking at the concrete proposals for the trade agreement between the UK and the EU. There is a draft text that has been presented by the European Union, the EU Commission, and by the UK government. And the reason for this evidence session was so that the EU subcommittee, the environmental subcommittee, to the EU House of Lords Committee could send a letter to the government raising points of concern and perhaps charting a way forward.
Now, and can you tell us why did you have to give evidence to these committees? Is to say what the current situation is in relation to the environment, or what? How did it take place?
Yeah, so I, with a team of researchers, mainly in the Center for International Sustainable Development Law, which is a research network that operates out of McGill University. We've been doing quite a bit of research on trade provisions that impact on climate change and have a relationship with climate change. So 5 years ago, we issued a working paper on innovative provisions in regional trade agreements. And so last year we were asked by the European Climate Foundation to perhaps give some thought to possible innovations in the EU-UK relationship when it comes to climate change. So long before the withdrawal agreement was actually agreed, we wrote a paper, and we launched the paper in a discussion which also featured Pascal Lamy, the former Director General of the World Trade Organization, for example, looking at innovative provisions that the UK and the EU could agree in order to address the issue of climate change and trade. And all of this research builds on prior publications. So over 10 years ago, we published a book on sustainable development in world trade law. And then 5 years ago, we published a book on sustainable development in world investment law. So it's a real continuation of that research agenda. And that's why the committee officer approached me. He had seen the presentation last year and was wondering, now that we have some draft text, what my opinion was on that draft text.
This is all to do with Brexit and how you approach climate change, correct?
That is correct, right? In the Faculty of Law here, I also convene a course on EU external relations law. So the committee also had quite a few questions as to what might be agreeable to the European Union, drawing on free trade agreements that the EU already has, and some of the sort of red lines that the EU Commission has issued. And I was trying to explain some of the thinking behind, for example, the proposal by the EU to have common standards in certain areas, including climate change, between the EU and the UK, and what the rationale is to have a level playing field, and how those level playing field provisions could actually operate.
So is there anything you can draw from it in relation to how we will resurface from COVID-19 and keep up with the carbon targets?
Yeah, that's going to be a huge challenge, right? Because so many countries are just faced with dire economic situations, and at the moment are not necessarily thinking about what should the future look like. What is actually the future that we want to cite the report of the Rio Plus 20 kind of summit. But it is really important. So two messages from the research we've done on climate collaboration and trade is that when it comes to a global issue, such as a global pandemic or such as climate change, there's no made-at-home solution to this challenge. You need international collaboration, you need exchange of ideas, exchange of research, and not only is that international collaboration possible, it is also necessary in these times of crisis. And the second message is that we can't just do business as usual. We see that in our daily lives at the moment, which are comparatively restricted due to the virus, but we will see more of those kind of climate restrictions going forward in the future. So unless we change fairly radically how we do business and we transition much faster to a greener economy, prioritizing non-polluting economic activities, we will end up with very similar restrictions to the ones we've now faced with the virus crisis. So I would say going forward with this crisis, what is really important is that we really collaborate with other countries, and that we invest the valuable public money that we're currently investing to shore up the economy in areas that actually have a future in a zero carbon or carbon negative world, right? We really need some of that kind of analysis, as we've seen with the Cambridge Zero submission to the European to the UK Universities Association, that the post-pandemic recovery needs to be a much greener, a much more sustainable recoveries rather than business as usual.
So in relation to the law, how important do you think law should play into the whole recovery? I mean, should international trade laws be changed? Should local laws be changed, and national laws? And what type of role can law play in all this?
Yes. So unfortunately, it's not an either or, right? In many ways, the law has to change at all levels. A couple of years ago, we contributed to a book that was called International Law in the Era of Climate Change, that looked at all different areas of international law, including law of the sea, for example, and suggested how these rules might be impacted by climate change and how those rules might have to change. And in trade and investment terms, we need to adapt these rules so that green economic activity is prioritized over polluting activity, and greener investments are protected rather than sort of gray, dark investments. When it comes to national laws set an important, basically set the framework for future economic activity, right? The fact that the UK and the EU have adopted 2050 as broadly carbon neutrality objectives, and the fact that the EU draft for the post-Brexit trade agreement even enshrines that in an international trade agreement, is an important signal, provides an important signal for all economic actors, right? Rather than sort of penalizing polluting behavior, we need to incentivize non-polluting behavior, and we need to accelerate the transition to a much greener economy. And the law can be one of the tools that helps us on our way. Sometimes lawyers are professionally blind, and we think, oh, if we just adopt a law, that will solve all problems. No, this is a strictly interdisciplinary exercise. We need economists, we need scientists, we need environmental scientists that advise policymakers, and then we need lawyers to enshrine some of those priorities in law. And I would say that's the future going forward. But the sort of long-term objective that has already been enshrined in the Paris Agreement, which we sometimes call the constitution of climate law, the long-term objective in the Paris Agreement has provided the sort of crucial impetus for countries to really change their long-term perspectives on climate change, and, for example, phase out coal, hopefully phase out other fossil fuels rather sooner than later.
And for people that are not aware of what, or they don't really know what the Paris Agreement means, can you just mention it very briefly, what the Paris Agreement entails?
Yes, so in 2015, the Conference of the Parties of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change which is a 1992 document, agreed that we need to be much more ambitious, and every country needs to do their share. So countries agreed to submit their nationally determined contributions to solving climate change as a global problem to the members of the Paris Agreement. And ever since, we've been working on the implementation of that Paris Agreement. But what is innovative about the Paris Agreement is are two things. On the one hand, it's a bottom-up approach that is boosted by transparency and financing rules. And on the other hand, and for lawyers, that's really important, and for all economic actors, that's really important. There's a long-term goal in terms of limiting the warming to under 2 degrees Celsius with a view to 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. And that objective, in a way, can only be achieved if most industrialized countries reach carbon neutrality by 2050. And it sets the tone for the entire world. And that's why the Paris Agreement is important. And I should say, it has entered into force, and it has near global membership. I think 194 countries, more countries have ratified the Paris Agreement than are members of the United Nations.
That's really good to hear. And moving on now, in relation to international trade again and the Commonwealth, I believe you're preparing a paper. You have an upcoming paper for the Commonwealth Secretariat. Can you disclose anything about this paper yet?
The paper exists in draft form. We had an experts panel in the Madrid climate negotiations, and we received expert comments on our Commonwealth paper, going to be published in the Trade Working Paper series of the Commonwealth Secretariat. And what we looked at in particular for the Commonwealth were issues of vulnerability and least developed countries and disaster risk reduction. So in addition to what have Commonwealth countries agreed with regards to trade and climate change, we also looked at what innovations, what innovative provisions have they adopted with regards to vulnerability, disaster risk reduction, especially applicable to least developed countries. I presented a version of this paper in a ministerial roundtable on the graduation of least developed countries into just normal developing countries. That might sound a bit technical, but least developed countries are defined by the UN. And once your country has generated a lot of economic activity and has lifted quite a large part of their population out of poverty, you then graduate to a normal developing country. And the Commonwealth Secretariat is supporting quite a few of the Commonwealth governments in that process. And those governments were asking, so what kind of, if we're a small island nation, maybe a least developed nation, what sort of provisions should we include in our trade agreements? And we drew on examples mainly or just from Commonwealth countries. For example, we looked at New Zealand's trade agreement and found really innovative language that would protect those countries in the case of a national crisis, sea level rise, slow onset of disasters, or any other sort of emergency and extreme weather events. So you can safeguard those issues in a trade agreement, and we basically explained how we think this should be done.
Oh, excellent, would be very interesting to read. And moving on a little bit now, sort of on similar lines in relation to what can be done. Now, recently there was on the news that Denmark has done something talking about the law that could make climate change illegal. But can we actually make climate change illegal?
I would love that, if we could just make climate change illegal. International lawyers are slightly jaded about this because in 1928, the world came together in a global agreement in the Briand-Kellogg Pact, which made war illegal in the world. And then, just a couple of years later, we had the Second World War. Law doesn't work like that. What is interesting, however, is that if we send signals, such as the Briand-Kellogg Pact, which then actually influence the UN Charter, and the UN Charter has worked relatively well in at least preventing a global kind of conflict, a world war. We need to sort of think beyond the existing toolkit, and that is maybe where the Danish law and some of the other national laws that have been adopted come into play, right? Quite a few countries have now included combating climate change as part of their constitutional framework. So it's part of the constitutional text that elevates the issue quite significantly in countries that have a written constitution. And we have quite a few sort of international agreements which allow countries to adopt measures. The most important signal at the moment, as I said, comes from the Paris Agreement and the implementation of the Paris Agreement. And so if you then sort of implement the Paris Agreement and you actually put into law everything you said you would do in your national determined contribution, that is a very strong framework that could indeed make climate change illegal, in not by instituting a sort of criminal provision, but by adopting all the necessary legal tools in order to transition to a low carbon or zero carbon or even carbon negative economy. And unfortunately for climate change, as listeners will know, there's no silver bullet. So it's about the package of measures that countries adopt. And if those measures are put into law, into a legal framework that is binding, well, then they have a lot more traction. They mean that companies almost immediately change their economic activities, and that is very positive. But the sort of headline of making climate change illegal is a bit of a headline grabber, because there's no single law that could achieve that. It's about the sort of mix of measures that we adopt at the national and international level.
And in relation to students that are currently studying law or incoming students, do you think that the way that law is being taught is actually helping to make them think more about climate and the environment, or is it just is pretty much basically, look, I want to specialize in this area, therefore I'm going to take X, Y subject, or has that changed? Have you seen that change a little bit in the past few years?
Yeah, so we're working on curriculum development almost constantly, and that is one of the changes that I'm trying to promote in my faculty. Right, the sort of times when we had the luxury to teach climate change or environmental law more broadly in a silo. So only if you take the specialized course will you have any exposure to environmental issues or climate change issues. That kind of luxury is over. In many ways, we need to streamline environmental and climate change issues throughout what we teach. So if you're teaching a tort law class, there should be an element of environmental torts. If you're teaching a land law class, there should be a segment on what happens with climate change and if sea level rises. So in most areas of domestic law, I would say we need an element of environmental expertise. Of course, I would still encourage students to take the dedicated classes, because in a way we need experts with climate change knowledge in all areas, right? If you're working for revenue and customs as a lawyer, you need to know about environmental taxation. If you're working for the Treasury, you need to know about climate change accounting. If you're working for the Bank of England as a lawyer, you still need that kind of climate change environmental knowledge to, for example, assess environmental friendly investments and exposure of companies to climate change. So it's no longer an either or. We need to integrate some of the excellent research that is done in this field and in the intersection of different areas of law, and distribute them more evenly throughout the curriculum. Colleagues always say, well, aren't you then fearful that your own course in EU sustainable development law and international environmental law will disappear? Well, in many ways, I'm less fearful that would happen, because there will still be the necessity of having experts that really have an in-depth knowledge as to how climate laws and climate governance work will increase over the next 3 decades. So I'm not fearful that my subjects might disappear. I would encourage all lawyers to really reflect on how the area of law that they're studying has a relationship with climate change. And that would be, I think, a truly innovative curriculum going forward.
Indeed, it sounds very interesting if that could take place, and if all lawyers as well could think of how climate change affects their area of practice. And one more question as well, I was just thinking there in relation to sort of headlines. And recently as well, there was a call for the Sustainable Development Goals to be changed or moved a little bit, or sort of placed in a different priority because of the pandemic. What is your view on that?
I completely disagree with that. Especially the global pandemic has shown that we need to take the Sustainable Development Goals much more seriously. 3 years ago, I gave a talk to the Oxford Faculty of Law, the International Law Research Group there, talking about the emerging legal value that the Sustainable Development Goals have. Right, more and more countries implement the Sustainable Development Goals not just as policy, but are enshrining some of the objectives of the Sustainable Development Goals in law. And more countries are basing international legal arguments on the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think that is the correct development. In some ways, the climate scientists have predicted global pandemics, have predicted extreme weather events. So this current COVID-19 crisis will not be the last global pandemic. Rather, we need to change our ways more quickly, try to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, maybe even ahead of the 2030 deadline, in order to be prepared for the next wave of the next global disease or a global drought or a global extreme weather event, right? The reaction to say, oh, these objectives are too onerous, in my view, is a wrong direction of travel. If anything, we need to accelerate compliance. Also, to address some of the injustices that were laid bare in the current crisis in terms of social inequalities, gender inequalities, racial inequalities. All these objectives are actually contained in the Sustainable Development Goals. And so I would say what we perhaps should be considering is enshrining some of these Sustainable Development Goals in law, make them legally binding, so that companies don't have to justify why they're changing, for example, their economic practices. If you adopt a law that mandates some of these changes, well, it's obvious to anyone why you're complying with the law. So that would be my answer. More compliance, increased and accelerated compliance with the Sustainable Development Goals, rather than the opposite. And in a way that would then provide us with a policy program, how to build back better, how to have a fully green recovery, rather than just a sort of slightly greenwashing of investing in business as usual.
That's excellent. Yes, I like that. It's interesting how you go back into full circle. And as the last question, you're talking about the future. If you had a magic wand to see into the future, what would you like to see in that future?
I think a future that is carbon negative, that is in full realization of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, is actually a very bright future. It is full of economic activity, just not the kinds of activities that we see at the moment. It is full of social and sort of mental well-being. It is a world that is much less polluted than today. And, why would you not want such a future going forward is always my question. Air pollution caused by individual car traffic, when you could choose a future that is a much brighter and offers a much higher quality of life for all. And, there, again, we come back to the points I mentioned earlier. This endeavor is not just focused on the United Kingdom. This endeavor is a global endeavor. So to just suddenly sort of retract and retreat to your own country, not seeing that other countries are either struggling with very similar challenges, or their starting point is in a completely different ballpark, so that we need to collaborate with them, as I would argue the Commonwealth Secretariat tries to do, is really important in this quest. So even if we transition beautifully to a much greener, much more sustainable economy, and we had fulfilled all Sustainable Development Goals but left the entire world behind us, we wouldn't have achieved anything in the future. So again, those two elements, international collaboration backed up by law that transitions to a carbon negative, greener economy, that would be my vision of the future.
Fantastic, Markus. Thank you very much. I mean, I could keep asking you questions talking about, for example, the whole issue of access to justice and how we reach that, but I suppose that will be thought for another day.
Yes, thank you very much for having me.
If you just joined us, you're listening to Cambridge Zero Climate Talks. Ashwini, thank you very much for joining us today. For our audience, can you please tell us your full name?
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me. My name is Ashwini Laxminarayana, and I work as a software engineer. I have a full-time job. I am a parent to a very adorable 22-year-old daughter.
So Ashwini, in relation, I mean, you have a very young child still, she's less than 2 years old. How do you see climate change and the current sort of environmental situation taking place all over the world, for example, heat waves? How do you see climate change affecting your life and your life as a parent?
I do tend to worry a lot about climate change and especially its impact on my daughter's future. So, for example, it is well known that microplastics are being found everywhere. It's being found in the food we eat and the air we breathe. And it is probably having some long-term health effects on everyone. So I do worry about her long-term health in regards to how heat waves are going to affect her or how eating plastic is going to affect her. I do realize that this is an extremely privileged thing to be saying that maybe in future it will affect her, but there are a lot of parents for whom this is a reality for quite a long time. For example, especially countries where recycling is being dumped from the UK and being burnt, they are already seeing a lot of effects on themselves and on their children. So this is quite difficult for me to see because I know that climate change affects poorer communities first, and it should not be that my child should not suffer and somebody else's child suffers, but it should be like, why is anybody suffering at all because of this?
And you feel that governments at a local or at the national level, international level, should more be done? I mean, you see the youth striking for climate and you're trying to see, for example, now the green recovery and say, yeah, we're going to, for example, promote more green jobs. But first as a parent and second as somebody in the labor market, how do you feel that all this affects the everyday life of what you do? Does it make any difference to you? Or it does, or for example, it does help you a little bit to think a bit more about, well, am I going to buy, let's say, a plastic toy or a wooden toy, for example? Does it make any difference?
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of this comes down to awareness, and because I am quite aware of these problems that about climate change, I do tend to make more mindful decisions about what I consume. I think for me, I am the most powerful thing I can do is to be a more conscious consumer. And I do tend to buy more local produce or secondhand toys for my daughter. And maybe someday in future, I will, take her to some activities or workshops and try to make her understand why I chose reusables, even though it's a little more inconvenient, or why I choose second-hand toys or clothes, even though it's not trendy to do so. But I do think that this climate change is not a problem that can be fixed by one person or an organization. It should be a collective effort from governments, organizations, and us as consumers. And we need to collaborate so that we can see a better future for our own children.
And now you mentioned the word consumer a few times. How do you see yourself as a consumer? And when you think about the current pandemic, it seems that everything is back into more packaging once again, because, plastic seems a bit, you're not going to be touching anything that you feel that is going to basically make sort of maybe that is infected, sort of this perception that if it's covered in plastic will be cleaner. So do you think that as a consumer, you're seeing a drawback into all the gains that had been made, that now because of the pandemic, everything is sort of going back to this way it was before we started to talk about plastic? How do you see that?
Yeah, definitely. I do see that a lot of it has come down to cleaning excessively. And I think maybe that's necessary for now. But it will be a phase where there will be a time when this will probably get over and we can go back to our old lives. I know myself that in the beginning of the pandemic, I used to shop only, loose vegetables, but that changed because I didn't have the time or the energy to actually go and choose loose produce. And I ended up buying packaged produce, which I didn't like, but slowly I think it's gone back to my old normal. But I would definitely like to see more shops reduce the packaging that they have. And I do believe that, packaging that comes from them should not be with us. It should go back to them to see that they can do something of that, not just dump it on us and make it our problem to either put it in recycling or the general waste and things like that. Like, I don't think consumers should be blamed fully for the problems of climate change. It should be everyone. It should include everyone. We're all in this together.
As a last question, if you had a magic wand,
the type of future I would like her to have is to be more with nature, which is kind of getting a bit difficult, especially when you have cities sprawling out. I would really like her to have to understand why trees are necessary and why. I just want her to be with nature, and seeing that spaces with nature are slowly are slowly going away. It's going to be a huge problem, but I just hope that somehow it gets fixed, I guess. But I also want her to raise her voice and raise concerns about what is not right in terms of excess consumption or excess plastic use, or just oil companies being really dumping their waste into the seas and things like that. And I hope I can bring about that change in her. As a last word, I think I want to add that I think to influence some kind of change in my daughter, I have to be the person who is doing this first. So I have to be someone she can look up to and say that, I brought about the change in her. So I have to, practice what I preach to her. And and things that I do for that is, being mindful about my consumption and making sure I don't overconsume or stop buying stuff that is not good, and signing petitions, maybe sending letters to the government about things that can be done better. So these are some of the things I can do. And also maybe when she's slightly older, I can probably take her to workshops or activities that teach her about climate change.
Ashwini, thank you very much. You've been wonderful. And this is all for this week. We hope you have a wonderful weekend, and we'll be with you next week.